we're going to be addressing Tyler Vela's fallacious arguments and misapplications of what I have said in the past about John Calvin and the old Servetus argument. It's going to be a fun episode. Let's dive in.
Choose another way. I ain't trying to do what everybody else doing, just cause everybody doing what they all do. If one thing I know, I reap what I sow. I'm walking down this road that leads me home. So am I wrong for thinking that choices are for real? Now am I for thinking we're responsible when we see, but that's just what is real.
It's time for the Soteriology 101 podcast, where God is most glorified by his love and provision for all people. Welcome your host, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists, an adjunct professor of theology, and a local teaching pastor, Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Welcome to Soteriology 101. Today we're going to talk about a little bit of a controversial issue. This is something that, if you followed along for a number of years in the podcast, we had a back and forth with a man by the name of Tyler Vela, who was actually a debate opponent in another discussion that I had some time ago. And anytime my podcast or my name is mentioned on other episodes, I've got so many great listeners. My inbox starts filling up with notifications, and this week I got a bunch of notifications about this episode with Tyler Vela, and he is doing an episode with the Bible thumping wingnut, Theology gals. They're apparently that network of the Bible thumping wingnut network has done a podcast with Tyler Vela, who I've done several articles on before and talking back and forth. He and I had a public disagreement on Facebook, and I've tried to contact him in a personal way to reconcile, to no avail. I've talked to some of his friends who are also Calvinistic and try to reconcile that way and have not been successful in doing that, and that's unfortunate. It's gotten to the point now that he's just... I might try to be nice and say he's misrepresenting me, or maybe he's accidentally saying the wrong things, but it's to the point now that he's acknowledged things that I've said to him, so I know he's read them, I know he's seen my actual statements, and so now it's to the point where he's just lying. And I hate to say that in a public forum, but he's doing it in a public way, and so I don't know how else to say that. And I think he's otherwise probably a great guy. All of us can do this. I remember back when I was going back and forth with James White on some issues. Y'all remember the Brian Abishano program where he came on talking about 1 John 5:1, the order salutis and everything. Somebody had sent me a timestamp of the Dividing Line episode, and apparently earlier in the Dividing Line episode he had said some things that helped to clarify something he said later, and I only played the latter portion on the broadcast because that's what was sent to me. It wasn't intentional, it wasn't something I was trying to do, but White blasted me for it and saying, "What you bring this scholar on and you only play for him this section and didn't play the whole thing. You didn't get it in the full context, and you misrepresented what I was actually trying to say because you didn't play the whole thing." And he was real angry. And I got on to the program and was ready to record. I put in the show notes, I put a link to the whole thing, and I told everybody to listen to it, and I was just going to come back with him with fire, and just really blast him and tell him, I wasn't trying to misrepresent you and don't call me a liar and all this kind of stuff. And I was going to, but as I thought about it, I thought, what would I want others to do for me that I'm doing to them? And how would I want others to treat me? And I thought, I did not, I did not fully represent him, even though it was my own mistake. Somebody didn't send me the whole thing. I should have been more due diligent and so I did. My next podcast started with the song, "I'm Sorry, So Sorry." And I just owned it. And I said, this is not Brian Abishano's fault. This was my fault. I should have listened to the whole episode. I didn't play that whole clip. And I had to swallow my pride. I didn't want to do that. Okay. I want to admit that I didn't play the full thing, but I had to. And as men, we don't like to do that. We don't like to swallow our pride and admit that we did something wrong. And I think Tyler here young guy. He's a good-looking guy. He's smart, very, very intelligent man. Listen to his stuff. If you don't believe it, you can pick up on his intelligence. He's and usually the fault of guys that are very, very intelligent, good-looking young guys, usually the fault is the pride thing. That's not always, but it usually is. And when you put yourself out there and you say something, and then you kind of get caught saying something wrong, and then you're called out on the carpet for it, and you can either go one of two ways. You can say, yeah, I did something wrong. I said something that's incorrect. I'm sorry, that I should have said it differently. Or you can double down and just sink your feet in and clench your teeth and go after it. Tyler, unfortunately, has chosen the latter. He's maligned and misrepresented me from the very first back and forth discourse. And it started with an article I wrote on Servetus. And it's really funny because I start the article by criticizing rabid anti-Calvinists for maligning Calvin and his character and everything else based upon the whole Servetus thing. And I actually mock people who yell Servetus and all that kind of thing. You go back and listen to the podcast. It's on record. You can go back and listen to it, which I know Tyler knows that exist. I sent it to him, so I know he knows these things. And yet he just did this other recording painting me once again as one of those rabid anti-Calvinists that calls, Calvin bloodthirsty and just horrible, and that Calvinism is totally, just horrible, bad people and all this kinds of things. And Calvin's just, horrible, bad. Look what he did, Servetus. So we should just think of all Calvinists. That's the way he's painting me. Of course, people who listen to my broadcast know that's absolutely ridiculous. That my best friend in the world is a Calvinist. My brother is Calvinistic. My nephew is Calvinistic. I have great friends who are Calvinistic. I'm respectful to Calvinists. And then I actually call out rabid anti-Calvinist for that kind of rhetoric and call them out for doing it and tell them not to do it. So people who listen to me hear this kind of stuff from Tyler and go, you sure that you're talking about latent flowers? Are you sure about that? Because he's the one who actually gets on to people like that and speaks out against them. And so for whatever reason, I think what happened, and I'm just guessing here, but I think probably what happened is Tyler is so used to being berated by that kind of anti-Calvinist rhetoric on his program and other things. And so he saw my article called, Why Servetus is a valid argument. And he automatically just kind of assumes Leighton's taking the same approach as all these anti-Calvinists. And he didn't really give it a fair reading, or something. I don't know, and therefore then he put it out on Facebook. He made all these accusations about me on, I can't believe you're a professor, and you're all these kinds of things he just put on there. I don't want to get into the details, but when I pulled it back up and I did a broadcast going over it, you can go back and listen to that podcast and go over how the reasoned between the two arguments, and I'll show you some of this today as we listen to this program, because I want you to judge for yourself. And the reason I'm doing this is because one, the Bible Thumping Wingnut is a highly viewed and listened to program, and so there are people who possibly have only heard that program who think that Leighton Flowers is a rabid anti-Calvinist who thinks that John Calvin and everybody who holds to Calvinism are bloodthirsty, killing of heretics and all this horrible, bad kind of thing. And that's never been my position. It's never been the way that I've addressed these issues. In fact, just the opposite is the case. And Tyler will not acknowledge that he's made that error and that he's maligned me. And Frank Viola by the same type of thing. And I'm going to show you Frank Viola's original article where actually he's very reasoned and actually quotes from other Calvinist historians showing that Calvin was a man of his day and that this was more common in that practice of that day. And he was very reasoned in his article, saying that we shouldn't throw out Luther and Calvin and all these other guys just because of their errors in these areas of doctrine. He was very, very reasoned in his article. Tyler doesn't read any of that. He just paints us as this Calvinists as these bloodthirsty kind of individuals. And the reason that people want to do that is we've talked about this in debate strategies before. It's a fallacy. It's using fallacious argument. It's trying to marginalize your opponent as being a weird, rabid, mean, the Calvinistic, anti-Calvinistic derangement syndrome, as White likes to put it. If I can put people over here with foil on their heads and make them seem just really mean and angry and nasty, then I can I can just marginalize them and dismiss them. And Tyler is trying to do that with me. And I understand it. I fell into those same kind of argumentations before. I've done that to people, and especially when I was in my 20s and 30s. I was more likely to do that. And I'm just trying to call us to a higher discourse and to say we don't have to go to that fallacious kind of argumentation. We can be reasoned here. We can understand that Calvin taught some great things. I don't know. I can go back and show all of my quotes of how many great things I've said about Calvin and Piper and Luther and how much I've learned from them and his stuff on prayer. I don't remember if you remember my podcast on prayer about how I talked about Calvin's work on prayer is some of the best I've ever read to this day. And how much that I think Calvin has contributed, and Augustine too, that I talk about Augustine and his work, and how much I appreciate many of the teachings, though I disagree with them on other issues. And it's possible, as I think it's Aristotle that says it's possible to entertain a thought. The mark of an educated mind is to be able to entertain a thought without necessarily accepting it. That we don't have to malign each other in a overly polemic, negative way, as I think you're going to hear Tyler do in this broadcast. So let's pull this up again. This is Colleen Sharp with the Theology Gals with the Bible Thumping Network, and so let's listen in.
I guess that just to give a little background, there was something that Blatant Flowers had written about, and it kind of misrepresented something. Just kind of explain what happened there, because basically Tyler has written a series that I'm going to be linking in our episode notes, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. And so I'm going to let him kind of tell you how it came about.
Yeah, so Blatant Flowers wrote an article on the Servetus and Calvin affair, indirectly about the Servetus and Calvin affair. So he was basically arguing that Calvin's, what he'll call theological fatalism, which is a misunderstanding that he has of Reformed theology, led inextricably to Calvin's treatment of those who he said, quote unquote, disagreed or dissented with him. Right? He won't even call Servetus a heretic or anything like that. And so he.
Okay, let's go over a couple things here. First, the accusation of misrepresentation. I wrote this article a while back called You Don't Understand Calvinism, and after years of discussing this topic with many Calvinistic brothers, I've come to this firm conviction: it's impossible to rightly represent a view for which you disagree to the satisfaction of every opponent. And this is not meant to suggest that we shouldn't at least try to represent those with whom we disagree. We should never intentionally misrepresent or strawman the views of our brethren. This is why I almost always play a clip of notable Calvinist or redirect quotes when bringing a critique against the Calvinists and the claims of Calvinism. In fact, I began all my teaching sessions, and I've got a link there of those teaching sessions on the subject, public teaching sessions, telling students it's only fair to learn Calvinism from actual Calvinists. On the other hand, I've yet to hear a notable Calvinistic scholar represent traditionalism in a way that I or my other traditionalist friends and scholars would actually appreciate. Why is this? And then I go through the accusation of misrepresentation and why there's so many accusations of misrepresentation, which is what you're hearing from the Theology Gals here and Tyler accusing me of misrepresenting Calvinism as theistic fatalism. Now, I'm very clear in my my work on theistic fatalism that Calvinists don't claim to be fatalistic. I actually have an article on, quote, the question, is Calvinism theistic fatalism? And I very clearly quote from Calvinists denying fatalism. And then I go on to explain that that the argument is not that Calvinists claim theological fatalism, but that I believe the logical end of Calvinism is theological fatalism. And so and I give several reasons here, but one of the reasons that I list that I wanted to bring out is this one. Not everyone's cut from the same cloth. In other words, not every kind of Calvinist is the exact same kind of Calvinist, like we've talked about before. Not the group is not monolithic. And this is a kind of a well-known quote that's used by E. Palmer, who's a well-known, acknowledged Calvinist that's quoted quite regularly. and this is just the same quote over, put twice. And it says, for the quote from Palmer, a well-known Calvinistic scholar, it said, foreordination means God's sovereign plan whereby he decides all that is to happen in the entire universe. Nothing in this world happens by chance. God is in back of everything. He decides and causes all things to happen that do happen. He has foreordained everything after the counsel of his will. The moving of a finger, the beating of a heart, the laughter of a girl, the mistakes of a typist, even sin. I've played Piper saying the exact same thing, that every dust mote, that every desire, every inclination, every evil thought, everything is meticulously brought to pass by God for his glorification. That, the Holocaust, child rape, that's a direct quote from the Mark Talbert book that's edited by John Piper and Justin Peters. So this is not something I'm just making up. These are quotes from actual Calvinists. Calvin himself on the sovereignty of God talks about how all things are brought to pass by God, that even the word permission is a vain refuge, that God brings all things about by his will, not by obtusely permitting them, that he is the author of them. It actually goes on to quote, we've been through that. People who've watched this learned and have seen these are actual quotes of Calvinists. Now, Calvinists don't claim to believe in fatalism, but the point of the matter is that even though Calvinists don't claim to believe a particular view, there is what is called the logical implication, and this is the other point here. It's the fifth point in the article, rationalizations and logical implications. And then I read from C.S. Lewis, who draws out a logical implication of total depravity. Roger Olson, somebody I admire, even though I disagree with him on some theological issues. He's a known Arminian, and his discussion with Michael Horton over those difficult issues, he explains how he realizes Calvinists do not view God as monstrous, but he would have to if he were to adopt the claims of Calvinism. In other words, Olson acknowledges that Calvinists do not believe God is morally evil or devil-like in any way, shape, or form, but explains that why he would have to draw that awful conclusion if he were to adopt Calvinism and remain consistent with his claims. This is called the logical implication of a claim. So if you believe this, then the logical implication is that this must be true. It's kind of like the whole issue of equal ultimacy or double predestination, that if you believe that God has elected before the foundation of the world certain individuals for salvation, then reprobation must also be true. It's a logical implication, though some Calvinists attempt to deny the concept of double predestination or reprobation in any sense of the word. Some lower forms of Calvinists that are very inconsistent in my estimation. And so the argument being made is not that Calvinists teach fatalism. The argument is that Calvinists, the claims of Calvinism, leads to, logically, must conclude theistic fatalism. And therefore, that's the argument that's been made. I'm arguing that all Calvinists act like fatalists or believe or teach that fatalism is true. It's a logical implication, much like Calvinists will often accuse us of having the logical implication of open theism, that we must deny God's omniscience if we don't believe in meticulous divine sovereignty. That's a logical implication. We don't believe that, and we'll argue against it, but that's the view they're trying to argue against us, that if you're going to be consistent, you must be an open theist. That's an argument for a logical implication. Matt Slick and I went back and forth on this, where he says, I don't believe that Leighton is intentionally denying the aseity of God. I believe his claims, if true, would deny the aseity of God. So he's making a logical implication to draw out. That's just debate, and it's you can make it nefarious to make it sound like, oh, Matt Slick is saying that I don't believe in the aseity of God, and blah, 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 he's just mean. And I can be really, really angry with him. Or I can understand that debate has certain argumentation that I know Tyler is very familiar with. I mean, he's a smart individual who debates with atheists and knows logic and knows the rules of logic. So I know he knows this. Why he hasn't applied that same principles with our interactions, I don't know. Again, I think it's because he kind of set himself against me in that first back and forth discourse. He painted me in that rabid anti-Calvinist camp, and he's put me there, and he's already kind of put himself out there as attacking me, and he can't back off of that for whatever reason. I'm not sure. So I'm having to correct his mistakes that he makes in public over and over and over again. I think purposefully now. I can only assume that it's purposeful, since I've sent him these things and I've tried to reconcile. I've gone through friends to try to reconcile and explain these things, and he's just not having any of it. So All right, before we go on, what I want to show you is the article that he's originally referencing here is why is Servetus a valid argument against Calvinism? This is back in July of 2016. And here's the podcast that I know he's listened to. He's told me he's listened to it. And so you can go listen to it here, and you can hear how I'm being just as reasoned as I am right now with you and going over these issues with you. And I read Frank Viola's original article where he quotes from, he actually sends this to a PhD, a Calvinistic PhD, a historical Calvinist and a historian, and says, am I being fair in this article? And then he publishes at the end of his article that guy's comments. That's how fair and balanced Viola is being in his article. And he starts the article by saying, we should not dismiss Calvin. We should not dismiss Calvinism even because of these actual claims. And so Viola is very, very reasoned and balanced in his approach. He's not one of the rabid guys that are just saying Servetus and, Calvin's a heretic and he should burn in hell. He's not. Viola's not that. I'm not that. But yet, as you listen to this, you'll hear that's the way Tyler paints us. And again, it's a marginalizing technique. It's a fallacy that he's trying to put the tinfoil on our heads so as to marginalize us and treat us as not mainstream and weird, wacky guys. So look how I start this article, and you tell me if this is balanced and fair. Back when I proudly wore the label Calvinist, I honestly knew very little about the French reformer named John Calvin or his actual writings. This label was simply a shorthand explanation of my soteriological views. When non-Calvinists would bring up Michael Servetus, a man killed under Calvin's rule in Geneva for disagreement over doctrinal matters, I would simply dismiss them as avoiding the biblical arguments in favor of ad hominem attacks on an old dead theologian who had little to do with the actual doctrines. I suspect that's where many modern-day Calvinists are on this issue. They could take or leave the label Calvinist, and might even prefer to leave it in favor of labels like Reformed or the affirmers of TULIP or sovereign election or doctrines of grace. Typically, Calvinists see the personal arguments about John Calvin's harsh treatment of dissenters as a distraction from the biblical doctrines that matter to them. Look what I say here. Honestly, Calvinists have a valid point here. And they do. I used to hate, and I said this on the first podcast, by the way. I used to hate when people would use the Servetus argument when I was a Calvinist. And as a non-Calvinist, I still hate it. Because it's an ad hominem kind of argument. It's like, TULIP must be wrong because look at what Calvin did. That's the argument. It's okay. So Philip Melanchthon also made mistakes in his history, but yet he sided more with us on our interpretation of Romans 9, for example. So therefore, do we say that our interpretation is wrong because of what Philip Melanchthon did? It's a fallacious argument, and I make that case in my first podcast, and I sent it to him. So I know he knows this, unless he just lied that he didn't really listen to it, and he said that he did. So honestly, Calvinists have a valid point. In other words, I agree with what Tyler is arguing for the most part, and many of his points. If the non-Calvinist is not willing to fully examine the biblical doctrines of soteriology as proposed by the Calvinist, they really don't have a ground to question. They really have no ground to question the namesake of the systematic. Proof that John Calvin treated dissenters and heretics. I'll use the word heretic. I have no problem using the word heretic. The proof that John Calvin treated heretics as sinful in a sinful manner and wrong by torturing them and killing them or advocating it or even acknowledging that it was okay or right to do, which he does, that does not prove that Calvinism's soteriology is wrong. Okay? I don't know how more clearly to say that. And I know that Tyler knows this, and yet even after he wrote this, after I acknowledged this and showed this to him, he still writes articles like this. This is another article written by Tyler Vela, which you can find this in February 5th. This is the Why Theology Matters response to Tyler Vela, which you can find on Soteriology 101. And this is from Tyler's article. There's a quote from him. It's a common anti-Calvinistic rhetoric to attempt to malign the person of John Calvin so as to cast aspersion on the so-called Calvinistic theological system itself. In a recent online conversation I had, Calvin was described to me as Jihad John, who ran the Christian Taliban in Geneva. and was an evil dictator like those of the 20th century, such as Stalin, Mussolini, and Castro. These attacks are not limited to merely hostile rhetoric, but also expressed through statements misrepresenting history and presenting the heavenly bias statistics, such as those we observed in part 1 of this series, and how Latent Flowers contributed to his overall tactic with his article reference there. So it wasn't me that said Jihad John and Mussolini, all that stuff. It's some other person, and then he's connecting them to me. So notice that he's putting the tinfoil from the rabid anti-guy onto my head. So you see what he's doing? That's the tactic he's using. So Tyler here, and this is my words, is attempting to lump me in with the harsher anti-Calvinist, despite the fact that my article began by repudiating the very approach Tyler condemns, and so did my podcast, both of which, when he's writing this, he knew. So one must wonder if Tyler is allowing his bias to cloud sound judgment and reason. I think it would become evident to the objective reader that indeed the underlying weakness of Tyler's entire rebuttal. He continues, in addition to this is Tyler, in addition to this, we find that likely due to the lack of actual research, fake citations are passed down through the ranks. In Frank Viola's blog post, Shocking Beliefs of John Calvin, which Flowers cites and parrots in his article, an apparent citation from the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, ODCC, states, Calvin was the cruel and unopposed dictator of Geneva. The problem is that neither Flowers nor Viola have done any research or found this quote for themselves or given a specific citation to anyone who has done any research using theological or historical dictionaries. The emotive evaluative nature of the language found in that quote should have been red flag that something was afoot and caused them to look further. Searching on Google, one can find countless references to this same quote, although often worded slightly different each time, but never with an actual citation or the article or page within the ODCC. After some research, I could find no such quote in any edition of the ODCC ranking back to 1997, while Viola has no relevant credentials that would lead one to believe he has been trained in proper research methodology. Flowers possesses a PhD, actually a D-Min, and should be held in higher expectations. His manner of carelessness in research, where any Google hit would be ambiguous in the anti-Calvinist literature. Why let facts interfere with the busy grinding away at their axe? Okay, so this was only one of many citations used in Viola's argument, which really had nothing to do with my article at all. I immediately moved away from Servetus to just acknowledge that Calvin believed it was okay to kill heretics and torture them. He theologically believed that was acceptable, which Tyler acknowledges, as we'll notice here. So now notice what I point out here. So he points of one of like 12, 15 citations. He points out one of them. And so if he can prove that one citation is questionable, then that therefore proves all the citations about Calvin or anything that happened with Calvin must be erroneous or wrong. That's obviously false. But he chooses one citation to try to hit on and therefore to demean Viola and myself as these rabid anti-Calvinists that don't know how to do research. So given that Christianity Today actually linked to this same ODCC quote here, and I quote where it goes there, I suppose it would be safe to say that Tyler considers the author's credentials of the Christianity Today to be equally inept as Viola and my own. Likewise, below is a list of 5 articles by 5 different Calvinistic brothers who also reference this same quote while still standing in defense of Calvinistic soteriology and Calvin's overall character. In other words, these 5 quotes, all linked right there, are all used by Calvinists in defense of Calvinism and Calvin's character, mind you, all use the exact same quote. And the last did link to the proper citation as from the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church. And you can see it there, 1974 edition, page 223, okay? So are all these Calvinistic authors' credentials also to be called into question by Tyler, who is not using, quote, proper research methodology in these instances? Tyler doesn't even acknowledge the dozens of other citations in Viola's argument. He just picks that one out that is questionable, even though others have used it, even other Calvinists have used it. And he wants to malign me and Viola based upon that. Now, before moving on, one should be aware that my parenthetical reference to Viola's article was only to validate a point that Tyler himself later conceded. So go back to my original article and let me show you what I'm talking about. This is the parenthetical quote that he spends all this time on. And so I disavow the anti-Calvinistic rhetoric of just throwing out Calvinism and TULIP based upon the wrong actions of John Calvin and his wrong beliefs. And I put just in parenthetical quotes here because it's not really the point of the article. Yes, it is documented fact that John Calvin did believe torturing and killing those who held to false doctrines, heretics, was justified. See this link for documentation. That's the link that goes to Frank Viola's shocking beliefs of John Calvin, which is reasoned, and you can go and read it for yourself. Okay, that's it right there. And this is something that Tyler actually acknowledges. And so this is the only thing I'm trying to prove, that Calvin wrongly treated people who disagree with him. That's all I was trying to prove. And you'll see that point here as we go through this. So he conceded that point. The only historical fact that needed to be validated for the claim in my first article is illustrated by Tyler's own concession. Here's Tyler's words, quote, "I can say that I 100% disagree with Calvin on his views of how to treat heretics." And in this podcast that we're listening to, he actually later on says, I think Calvin did make mistakes on this issue. So he concedes the exact same point that I'm conceding here, that I'm arguing, that Calvin wrongly believed that it was okay to torture and to kill atheist, heretics, bad people. And we today, and Tyler included in that, don't believe that. So given that I began the article with this concession, proof that John Calvin treated dissenters in a sinful manner does not prove that Calvinism's soteriology is wrong, and that it is a conceded historical fact that Calvin did treat dissenters, heretics, enemies wrongly, then we should be able to move on to the point of the article, the actual point of the article. But alas, that's not what Tyler chooses to do. Instead, he chooses to stick on his original representation of me as one of the rabid anti-Calvinists, the Mussolini guys, the painting him as the Jihad, that kind of a thing. That's where he's put me. That's where he's going to keep me, despite all of my efforts to go through his friends, to email him personally, to reach out to him, and to correct his misalignment of me over and over and over again, which you're going to hear in this podcast as we continue.
Tries to use Servetus as what he calls a valid ad hominem against John Calvin, because he's trying to show that the way that Calvin treated, or the way that he presents Calvin as treating Servetus, is precisely because of his theological convictions. And so it's kind of an end and around way to try to critique Reformed theology, basically.
Okay, so basically he's saying, yeah, it's because his bad theology that this thing happened.
Yeah, he's saying it's because Calvin's theological fatalism, his what he thinks is really hard determinism, that leads Calvin to kind of have this view. This isn't from Flowers' article, but this is the sentiment that he's trying to get across, leads Calvin to basically say,
Now, I want you to notice in this entire discourse, he never quotes from Leighton Flowers. He never shows Leighton Flowers' article. He never cites it directly. That is distinctly different than what I do. Notice I actually play him for himself. You hear, I have a lot of podcasts. They could have played my podcast right there live, just like I just now did for Tyler, and like I'm doing right now. So who's misrepresenting who? I'm letting them speak for themselves. I'm using their actual quotes. Do they quote from me? No, he just says, oh, well, Leighton doesn't actually say this. It's just the sentiment that I'm reading into what he's saying. That who's doing good scholarship here? Who's doing good research here? You be the judge for yourselves, guys. I've had several Calvinists who've contacted me about how Tyler has treated me and are embarrassed by how he's treated me. And rightly so, because he's not treating me in this, even with the level of respect I've seen him treat atheists and talk about atheists on his program. And again, I think it's just, we all can fall into it where we just get set in our ways. We're just determined to be right about something. We've painted somebody in and we've put our name out there and we've kind of already stepped in it, so to speak, instead of owning where we messed up and just kind of backing off and going, yeah, I kind of stepped in it there. We just double down. And it's what we do sometimes. Men do. I've done it before. I do it with my wife more often than I'd like to admit. My son did it to me this morning on the way to school. Okay, it's just what we do, especially men. We have this problem, and I'm right there with you, Tyler. I make the mistake all the time. Right now, it's just me that's the brunt of your mistake and your misrepresentation of me.
kill them all and let God sort out the bodies kind of mentality. And he's trying to say that that's related to Calvin's theology, and if that's the outcome, then the theology must be problematic.
Right. And, it just occurred to me, some of my audience might not be familiar with Leighton Flowers. And so he is a staunch anti-Calvinist. He says he used to be a Calvinist, right?
It's like when someone says, I used to be a Christian. I'm sure you profess that. It doesn't mean that you...
the theology of you can't be a former Calvinist. This is impossible. You can't be a former...
actually, understood it well or any.
Yeah, and I've actually have podcasts where I've played sermons from when I was a Calvinist, and you still have this kind of a thing. No matter what, Michael Brown has the same issue. I mean, he was a Calvinist for 5-7 years, something like that, and people still, well, you must not have ever really been a Calvinist, of course.
Anything like that. And from everything that he says about Calvinism, he either didn't understand it then, or he's intentionally misleading what he understood now. So.
Yet who actually plays clips of actual Calvinists and reads their actual quotes, and who's not? You be the judge.
Either way, he's been corrected so many times, and yet he repeats the same falsehoods. Really, that it's many of us are finally getting to the point where we're just like, the guy's just dishonest now. At this point, we many of us have been in the conversations where we know he's been corrected, and yet he still goes on as business as usual, like it never happened.
Okay, corrected for what exactly? For drawing the logical implication? Because that's an argument. You can disagree with an argument, Tyler, without being dishonest. I can actually say the claim of a Calvinist saying that God brings about moral evil for his glorification leads to theological fatalism. And it equates to a theological fatalism. If you believe this claim, then you must conclude theological fatalism if you're logically consistent. It's not saying that Calvinists, that generally speaking, guys like yourself, are teaching and believing that God's monstrous or that he's fatalistic or that everything's fatalistically determined. Never said that, never claimed that. I'm saying the logical implication of your claims lead to that if I were to adopt your claims as true, the claims of actual Calvinists as true, then I would have to conclude this is true. That's an argument. And I know you know that, Tyler, because you're trained in this field. You know what arguments are. And drawing logical implications is not the same as maligning you as believing God's actually monstrous or that you actually affirm fatalism. Again, I know you know better.
So
right. Yeah, I've seen where he's representing Calvinism and just not doing it well. And usually if someone, although I'm not sure I know very many people who used to be a Calvinist, but some of the things he says, that's hard to, like you said, he may not have understood it or he's just being dishonest. So the first part of your series, you kind of talk about why handling history matters, because Leighton Flowers doesn't really handle it very well. And I think in this kind of...
Yet she hadn't read anything that I actually wrote. I wasn't even trying to handle the history of it well. I really couldn't care less about Calvin's role in Servetus's murder. I really don't care. Even in the article, I say I don't care. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the very quote that he actually goes on to say is that Calvin believed that it was okay to kill heretics and that we should kill heretics. That was a theological belief that he held that Tyler himself denounces and thinks should not have happened. I don't know how. Let's move on. I mean, he spends most of this discourse, which we won't play this portion of it, but he spends most of this discourse going over the actual historical facts about Calvin's role as just the theological witness there, that he's not the actual one who makes a decision to kill Servetus. I agree. I don't think that he probably was either. But who cares? It does not matter to the point of the article, which I've pointed out to Tyler several times. The level of his involvement, Calvin's actual involvement in Servetus's murder, matters very little, especially if Calvin himself actually affirmed and believed that Servetus should have been killed, because that's the only point that really matters. That's the only point that was even being relevant in the article in the first place, which, if you go back to the article and you look at what I was attempting to pull out in the Servetus argument, is the whole he's a man of his day kind of an argument. Just to argue, this is the point I was kind of trying to make here in my article, to argue this was just the way things were at that day in the 1600s. It's just the way things were. It's just what people did. They just killed people. Well, yeah, the abuse of Rome had become this dictatorial governmental power that was corrupt and was heinously evil. They were not theologically minded people. They weren't even saved, in my estimation. Many of them, if they're doing this kind of stuff, they're just using government as power and control. They are unregenerate government dictators and tyrants who are killing people who dissent from the Catholic Church. And these reformers, Luther and others, are reforming the church, bringing it back to the root of true theological understanding. But Calvin, Luther, Zwingli are not the only reformers. There were people who, other people of that day, who are reforming or striving to reform the abuses of the Catholic Church, namely the Anabaptist and others, other groups there, which is what I go on to argue here. For instance, we learned from the link cited above. This is going on just giving the facts of Calvin had his own stepdaughter and son-in-law. They were condemned for adultery and executed, and Calvin affirmed this. In other words, Calvin believed that was theologically accurate to do. Now, whether he was actually, I don't think he was the actual one that swung the axe or tied him to the stake. He didn't actually do it. It was the city council that decided to do this, but he supported this. He thought it was theologically correct to torture and to kill people. That's just a fact of the matter. And again, Calvinists have recognized this. There have been apologies made. Lutherans apologized not long ago to the Anabaptists for their persecution of the Anabaptists and killing so many of them back in the 1600s. This is just historical facts of the matter, and so some of the arguments here: Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin followed tyrannical practices of the corrupt Catholic Church by promoting the use of state-sponsored torture and capital punishment against those who disagree theologically. In other words, they were continuing the error of Rome by continuing to use capital punishment, torture, burning people at the stake, who disagreed with them theologically, who were heretical, who were atheistic, who were horrible, bad people. Yes, but they would kill them. And my question for the article was, could their sociological doctrines have been an influence on their views of how Christians are to demonstrate grace and patience towards their enemies? In other words, could your theology matter when reforming certain bad practices like religious liberty and the lack thereof? I think this is a valid question, considering the common charge against Calvinists for their harsh treatment of others, even in modern times. For example, John Piper, one of the leading proponents of Calvinism today, even acknowledges this trend when he was asked the question, why are Calvinists so negative? And then he goes on to say, I love the doctrines of grace with all my heart, but I think they're a pride-shattering, humbling, and love-producing doctrines. But I think there's an attractiveness about them in some people in large measure because of their intellectual rigor. They are powerfully coherent doctrines, and certain kinds of minds are drawn to that. And those kinds of minds tend to be argumentative. So the intellectual appeal of the system of Calvinism draws a certain kind of intellectual person, and that type of person doesn't tend to be the most warm, fuzzy, and tender. Therefore, this type of person has a greater danger of being hostile, gruff, abrupt, insensitive, or intellectualistic. I just confess that it's a sad and terrible thing that that's the case. Some of this type aren't even Christians, I think. You can embrace a system of theology and not even be born again. In other words, what Piper here, I think, who's a very tender-hearted, kind Calvinist, and missions-minded kind of a Calvinist, but he's acknowledging a trend, a tendency of the type of personality that adopts the Calvinistic way of thinking tends to be harsher towards other people. That's just a fact of the matter. It's not trying to be mean. It's an argument. It's not trying to be anti-rabid mean to you guys. It's saying that this could be a tendency towards those whose personality is geared towards this way of thinking. And that's the question I'm pointing out here. Could the soteriological belief that God chooses to effectually save some and damn or reprobate the rest before the foundation of the world affect how you treat others? If you sincerely believe God loves all of his enemies, he genuinely desires for every one of them to come to repentance, that he died for all of his enemies, like the non-Calvinist beliefs, wouldn't you be more likely to show patience and grace to all of your enemies? That certainly seems to be a very reasonable conclusion, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem to be a reasonable conclusion to say, if you believe God really does love all his enemies, that you would be more likely to love all yours? That if you believe that Christ died for everyone, that you would be more likely to be patient and long-suffering with those who haven't come to faith yet? It's just reasonable. Moreover, does denying the concept of libertarian free will affect one's treatment of others? There are secular studies which indicate that affirming free will does have the positive effect on how we respond to other people. And I quote from a research citation there from Minnesota. That's actually something Mohler quotes in defense against the naturalistic determinism of atheists. And I even quote that here. Calvinistic scholar and Southern Seminary president, Dr. Al Mohler, actually addressed this trend in this podcast called The Briefing. And I have a link there. In Mohler's argument against naturalistic determinism, he states the subversion of moral responsibility is one of the most significant developments of recent decades. Through this subversion, though this subversion was originally philosophical, more recent efforts have been based in biology and psychology. I would read theology. Various theorists have argued that our decisions and actions are determined by genetics, environmental factors, or other forces, namely God's decree, maybe. So Scientific America is out with a report on a study linking determinism and moral responsibility. The diverse theories of determinism propose that our choices and decisions are an exercise of the will, but simply an inevitable outcome of factors outside our control, which, by the way, none of this Tyler ever addresses in his articles, at least the ones that I've read so far. He never even gets into this. This is the main point of my article, and he never even touches on this stuff. He doesn't touch on Piper's quote. Matter of fact, he says there's only one citation. It's to Viola's argument. And he doesn't even touch any of these other citations. He stopped reading there and just made all these blatant accusations and misrepresentations of my article. As Scientific America explains, continuing with the article from Mohler, determinists argue that everything happens is determined by what happened before. Our actions are inevitable consequences of events leading up to the action. In other words, free will doesn't exist. Used in this sense, free will means the exercise of authentic moral choice and agency. We choose to take one action rather than the other and must take responsibility for that choice. This link between moral choice and moral responsibility is virtually instinctive to humans. As a matter of fact, it is basic to our understanding of what it means to be human. We hold each other responsible for actions and choices. But listen to this. But if all our choices are illusory, and everything is merely the inevitable consequence of something beyond our control, moral responsibility is an exercise in delusion. That's Albert Mohler. Okay? So if everything is merely the inevitable consequence of something beyond our control, which our salvation is beyond our control under Calvinism. A man's reprobation is beyond that reprobate's control within Calvinism. Whether you choose to follow Christ or you choose not to follow Christ is beyond our control within the Calvinistic worldview. Therefore, moral responsibility, according to his own conclusion, is an exercise in delusion. That, again, how Mohler doesn't draw those two, that's a different argument, and I would love to have him on the show to ask that question. So that's what I even asked here. I said, how Mohler avoids the same charge against the theistic determinism of the Calvinistic claims, compatibilism is beyond me. After all, the inevitable consequence of something beyond our control, which leads to the delusion of moral responsibility, is the same problem for the theistic determinists as it would be for the naturalistic determinists when it comes to the practical implications of how one behaves. Whether one believes those choices are determined by, quote, Mother Nature or actual divine being would not change their inevitability and the resulting delusions of individual responsibility for those choices. So sociology affects behavior, I argue. The argument is that one's sociology does in fact impacts one's behavior. Therefore, pointing out bad behavior of those who held to certain sociological perspectives historically as evidence that the perspective itself has not typically resulted in healthy behavior toward others is a valid argument. In other words, let me use another controversial social issue besides religious liberty. Talk about slavery. Most clergymen who supported chattel slavery in the 1800s were from the Calvinistic Presbyterian bent. That's a fact of the matter. Basil Manley Jr., Fuller, a lot of the guys, the founders of the Southern Baptist Convention, were Calvinists, but they were also slave owners and promoted, using theological arguments, the promotion of slavery. On the other hand, the Sandy Creek tradition, the non-Calvinistic General Baptist, denounced this and were actually anti-slavery. Look at Wesley, who actually tried to abolish slavery and worked to free slaves. That's versus Whitefield, who actually promoted and argued theologically for slavery. I don't know I'm not trying to be mean in saying that. I remember that was kind of, when I was a Calvinist, that was kind of something I didn't like to talk about a lot. And I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to accuse Tyler or Calvinists today of being pro-slavery. Heaven forbid. No. Okay. Don't hear me say that. It's a historical fact of the matter, however, that when you believe that God has created certain people for a good, that he values the elect people in a special way, that lends itself to the same argumentations that white supremacists are making, that there's certain genetic makeups that are given by God to be superior than other genetic makeup. Just like somebody may argue for male dominance over women, because male genetically are made differently. Therefore, they're actually made by God to be better, or to domineer over women in some ways. There can be that argument. Now, does Piper make that argument? No. Calvinists today are much more sensible, and they're not stupid in making those arguments. But the point of the matter is that the arguments, the bad theology that I consider bad, obviously, because I disagree with Calvinism, helped to promote and to continue bad behaviors like the killing of heretics and bad behaviors like slavery, because it painted God not as impartial and creating all men equal, but instead as God creating certain people to be his elect, chosen people who are more valued than others. That the system itself promotes a false way of understanding the equality of man, to seeing all men as created equal, to seeing all men as favored and loved by God. The system itself promotes bad theology. Historically, that's true. As hyper-Calvinism grows out of Calvinism, fatalistic ways of thinking grows out of determinism, even though Calvinists themselves, like Piper, have not gone that far or would not promote that kind of level of thinking or that false belief. The system itself lends itself to bad theology and bad practice. That's the argument that's been made. And so if we're not responsible for our actions, Muller argues, then why would people do the right thing? The most immediate result of such thinking is a subversion of moral accountability. That's the argument I'm making. Okay, I'm making the same argument that Muller's making against naturalistic determinism is the same argument I'm making against the logical implications of the claims that Calvinists hold to with regard to their theistic views of meticulous sovereign control of all things, namely of our salvation and thus our subsequent behavior thereafter. That's the argument I'm making. Now, that's a valid argument. It's not meant to be emotive. It's not meant to be accusatory. It's not meant to say that Tyler Vela or John Piper or other Calvinists today promote slavery or don't promote religious liberty. They just the opposite is true. The point is looking at the history of things, looking that over 60% of the clergymen, according to studies, that promoted chattel slavery were from the Presbyterian and or Calvinistic led type churches. That's just a fact of the matter, and it's a blight. Southern Seminary was, Basil Manley Jr. was one of those guys that promoted slavery, and Southerns apologized for that. Again, those are just facts of the matter. I'm not trying to be mean in saying that. I'm just putting out the facts. Does that mean that there was no libertarian free will guys that held to slavery? No, there were some that did, and they were stupid. But the point is that a majority were Calvinistic, and they used their Calvinistic beliefs. Some of them even cited Calvinistic types of beliefs about God's election and God's foreordination of individuals for certain ends. They cited those things as reasons for their defense of slavery and, things like religious, abuses of religious liberty. Again, those are just facts of the matter. Now, whether Tyler actually wants to engage in that part of the argument, that's up to him. I think instead of engaging that part of the argument, he still wants to put the tinfoil on my head and paint me as the rabid anti-Calvinist instead of actually dealing with the real arguments that are being made, because it might it might be difficult for him to handle the real arguments that are being made. I'm assuming that's the reason he doesn't want to engage on that level.
So when we're talking about things like this.
Yeah, so it's really important, especially like you said on topics like this one, because in order for Flowers to make his point, he has to build it on a historical event. So
no, I can build the point that I was making on your concession, Tyler. That's the whole thing. Your concession, which is that John Calvin wrongly believed that it was theologically accurate, it was biblical to torture and to kill heretics, bad characters, people who, disagree theologically, whatever word you want to use. That I don't care about the actual event in history. I care about his theological belief and the basis for that theological belief. That's all I care about. That's why it's a parenthetical statement, just a parenthetical quote to something you actually have conceded, that John Calvin wrongly treated those who disagree with him. That's the only thing I have to base it on. I don't care about the actual event of Servetus
today. And so dealing with historical context is vitally important to not only understand the biblical text, but to understand any historical event. And Flowers just is I don't know if he's incapable. I want to say he's incapable, but in this incident, he didn't do it.
Right.
And especially, he's a professor. He has access to all of the theological libraries, all of the ATLA databases, the same things that I'm just a master's student, but I have access to all of the same type of databases that he has. And to be honest, it wasn't, a small amount of work to do the research, but it wasn't a massive amount to at least come to, a general understanding that I present in the articles.
Okay. So he's criticizing me for doing something that I wasn't even attempting to do. I guess to get a full outline of the historical events that led to Servetus's death, and I wasn't even trying to do that. You saw the article. It was a parenthetical quote saying that the concession that Tyler's already made, that Calvin didn't treat heretics the way that biblically he should have. That was it. That's the only point I was trying to make in that article, and it's the only point I was trying to draw out. It's the same point that Piper acknowledges about Calvinists and their tendency to be overly intellectualistic and thus sometimes harsh and mean towards other people, the cage stage that is known for Calvinism. You type into Google, why are Calvinists so, and Google fills in the blank for you, so mean, so rude, so arrogant, so this, and this. You type in the same thing for Arminians and other views, you don't get that. You might get, why are Arminians so stupid? Because so many Calvinists are out there calling us so stupid and dumb. It's just a fact of the matter that historically some of these things happened, and even Calvinists, reputable Calvinists, admit there are some bad historical things that Calvinists believed and did. And the point is, could our soteriological worldview and our view of God and his love for all of humanity, could that affect how we believe? In other words, maybe Calvin would have done better in reforming Geneva and reforming from the abuses of the Catholic Church had he held to correct soteriological worldview. That's the argument I'm trying to make. If he believed that God truly loved all people and truly died for all people and truly wants all people to be saved, could it be that he would be more patient with people who commit adultery instead of having their heads lobbed off, or even promoting the fact that they had their heads lobbed off, even though if he didn't directly is the one who did it? That's the point I was trying to make, and that's never a point that Tyler engages, and that was the point of the article, and he's still not engaging it to this very day. Actually, let me correct that. He does touch on our actual point of contention on page 5, part 1 of his discourse back and forth with me the first time. When he wrote this, he said the reformers, this is from Tyler, the reformers largely broke theologically with Rome on their soteriological views and understanding of the role of authority in Scripture. But there was a lot of movement on their civic views. This would evolve slowly over centuries. And the relationship of the church and state is still a contentious issue that future generations may look back and judge us for. Again, this does not excuse the actions of the earlier reformers as ethical or even biblical, but it does completely undermine the idea that Calvin's soteriological beliefs had any causal impact on his treatment of heretics. Now, that's the end of his quote there, end quote. So here's what I go on to argue in my article. I say, actually, Tyler's unwittingly, he's made my point for me. He concedes that Calvinist treatment of heretics at that time were inexcusable and that it took them much longer to evolve slowly, or reform those bad behaviors than it did men like, in other words, it took the reformers like Calvin, Zwingli, Luther, those guys, it took them longer and they were evolving slowly on the social issues like the religious liberty and slavery, those kinds of things. The bad behaviors than it did men like Balthasar Hubmaier, who argued that we should treat all people with love and patience because God treats all of us with love and patience. One must remember that Hubmaier was also playing a role in reforming the Catholic Church's sociology from one of works to one which is by grace alone through faith alone. In other words, the Catholic Church, in my estimation, were unbelievers. The Catholic Church, the rulers of that day, were heretics themselves, and they were practicing. And so later in this thing, he actually equates the Catholic Church with libertarians, with free will advocates like myself. And he was saying, this is the Catholic Church doing all these things. So he's equating us with the unbelieving abuses of the Catholic Church of that day and the people who were abusing the Catholic, the use of the Catholic Church in that day. He's equating that with other Protestants who believed in free will, like men like Hubmaier and others. And so that was one of Tyler's mistakes in this discourse as well. And yet it was Hubmaier's view of how God treats his own enemies, which led him to reform the Catholics' practice of mistreating heretics more quickly than we see from the Calvinist believers of that day. Now, can Tyler attempt to make a case that one's belief about how God feels towards and treats his own enemies cannot affect how one will choose to feel towards and treat their own enemies? Sure, he could try, but he doesn't. Instead, he belittles my profession and questions my integrity, which only goes to validate the very point I was attempting to show about the tendency of some Calvinists to mistreat those who disagree with them theologically. Do you see my point? In other words, Tyler is playing into the very point I was trying to make in my article by treating me with disrespect and maligning me and calling me dishonest and painting me with the foil on my head and totally mischaracterizing everything that I've argued. He's doing exactly what I'm accusing of the cage stage type of Calvinist, the intellectual type of guys that end up acting in pride and arrogance towards their fellow believers instead of acting with patience and prayer, because you actually believe that God loves and provides for all people. And therefore you treat people with respect and love because you actually believe God's impartial and that he's created all men with equal value and worth, not a special subset of people who have more value and more worth than the rest. Tyler goes on to argue, he writes this, he says, we must remember that in this article, where Flowers is attempting to argue, he's attempting to argue the proper theological beliefs, specifically soteriological beliefs, lead to habits of dealing with dissenters. That is his main thesis, end quote. Again, this is inaccurate, Tyler. My thesis was never to argue that Calvinism was the sole cause or start of this kind of mistreatment towards other people. As already noted, both Viola and I conceded that Rome and non-Calvinistic religious people, not likely born-again individuals in most instances, by the way, were practicing this bad behavior. I specifically addressed those reforming Rome's errors and how practical applications of their own soteriological beliefs helped in reforming those who formerly held bad beliefs and behaviors. Even if Tyler claims my article was not clear on this point, one need only listen to the podcast where I specifically go over this to discover my own intention. And that podcast was sent to Tyler prior to his writing of this article. And so he knows this, and yet he continues, even in this latest podcast, to misrepresent and malign my perspective.
Is kind of funny because if you actually count the body count between Reformed Protestants and those who held to a libertarian freedom, which would have been Rome at the time, it's actually...
Notice what he did there. So he equates those of us who are Protestants, reformers, guys who reformed from the ills of the Catholic worldview of that day, who disagree with Catholicism, who don't believe that those who held to that kind of Catholic beliefs were actually Christians and believers. He's equating unbelievers who use capital punishment and torture with me, guys who believe like I do. And then he goes and accuses me of being the rabid anti-Calvinist. Could it be that Tyler, maybe you're a rabid anti-traditionalist? Maybe that's what's driving your view of us, because you've just equated me with the horrible people of the Catholic Church who were killing people and using the government powers to take out Protestants all over the world, and you've just equated them with me. So, and I didn't do that to you. I didn't say that traditionalism must be bad because or Calvinism must be bad because of what Calvin did, and yet you're making the link now that traditionalism or the belief in free will, again, the concept or idea that that they held to the views that a Protestant who holds to, like Hubmaier does, the love of God for all people, that he actually argued that we shouldn't try to convince with sword and fire, but with prayer and patience, because God is patient with us, and he desires for all men to be saved. Therefore, that is the motivation and the reasoning that we should be patient and loving towards others. That's where theology matters. And our theology will drive our social justice issues, like the issue of slavery or the issues of religious liberty, if we truly hold to views that God has a genuine love for all people.
Actually, the view that is closer to Flowers' view that has the massively higher body count. So if he wants to try to say that soteriology drives body counts, it's much worse on him. But that being said, so you have two guys that are at the center of this. You have Servetus and Calvin. They're both well known for their publication. It's just one is well known for being orthodox and defending biblical Christianity, and the other one is well known among, again, Catholics and Protestants and everyone for teaching abject heresy. And we're more.
Okay, and none of us disagree with that. I talk about how Servetus and a lot of the group and a lot of the other people that were killed under, when Calvin was there and under his approval as the theological, head of Geneva, that they were bad people. I acknowledge that in the article. I'm not trying to say that they're good people. They're bad people. And the fact that he had them killed for those heretical beliefs, as bad as they might be, doesn't change any of the facts of the matter with regard to my original article or our points of dissension or any of those kinds of things. And again, that's where Tyler's just never willing to actually address our actual points of contention. He goes on to say this.
So when I hear someone like Flowers, or when I hear someone like Viola, or Dave Hunt, or any of the other major anti-Calvinists, or any of these people that are out there and say, oh, well, you have jihadi Jean, and you follow John Calvin the murderer, and all this kind of stuff.
Quote me saying that. Quote me saying that, Tyler. I've got all kinds of podcasts out there. Surely you can find a clip of me calling jihadi Jean and following the murderer. You've let me quote Viola. Why don't you read Viola's article for your listeners? You want to criticize me and us of misrepresentation and misaligning brothers, and yet I'm sitting right here trying to reach out to you, emailing you and your friends to try to reconcile, and you go on public broadcast calling and saying that I'm using jihadi John and following Calvin the murderer. How dare? And when I denounce people who do that kind of thing, Tyler.
I just know that they've done zero research whatsoever on the history of the event. I mean, again, Calvin not only didn't have an authority, Calvin wasn't even a citizen of Geneva whatsoever. There's actually an incident within the trial.
And he spends like 20 minutes on this broadcast talking about the history of it and all the things that Calvin did well. And he kind of gets into here in just a minute, but he acknowledges, but Calvin wasn't perfect. He did believe that it was okay to do this to, extreme heretics and to those who commit adultery and those kinds of things. That was the day of the time. So all that other stuff is superfluous to the point that I was originally writing in my article, and the point that Tyler never actually addresses. The point with regard to how theology, soteriology, can affect social issues like slavery, social issues like religious liberty, social issues like how we treat our enemies. That was the point of the article, and it was a point that Tyler doesn't even really address.
But what happens is when you don't do it, you end up having people like Flowers actually slandering a fellow brother. right?
Slandering.
Which is more of my concern, right? I can handle the theological nonsense that Flowers does. And I'm not here trying to stand up for Calvin because, I follow Calvin, which is just so misleading of rhetoric that comes from them.
Wow. So he's so concerned about slandering a brother while misquoting me. Well, not ever quoting me. Not even misquoting. Just doesn't ever quote me. He just paints me as the anti-rabid Calvinist when I actually denounce the very thing that he's trying to label me as being right now. It absolutely astonishing to me. Astonishing. You should be ashamed of yourself, Tyler. And I don't say that lightly. I very rarely call out another brother in public. I'm doing this because you did a public broadcast. But brother, you need to repent. I'm willing to reconcile with you. I've never made any kind of the quotes that you're saying. I've never said any of those things that you're trying to malign me as saying. You're maligning a brother who's living while accusing me of maligning a brother that's been dead for a long time, when in fact I actually defended Calvin in many instances against the rabid anti-Calvinists, and you won't acknowledge that. Even in private discourses, even after sending you podcast after podcast where I've addressed this, even after sending you emails and letters, even after contacting your Calvinistic friends, and you still won't acknowledge it.
But what it does is it leads you to a position where you're forced to actually slander and talk, and to call him a murderer and to insult people who just theologically agree with him as supporting him, right? All this kind of stuff. That's not in the spirit of Christian charity and Christian love and brotherliness, right? That's in nowhere in there. But
doing what you're doing to me is, right, Tyler? Saying that I can't believe that you're a professor, calling me out for what you said plagiarism because I cited Viola. And you thought I was citing my own sources when I was copying and pasting Viola's citations, which is what I linked to in that parenthetical statement, a point that you already conceded to, and you still have not apologized for that. And yet you publicly said that I should not be a professor, and you publicly said on Facebook that I have plagiarized. And even your own Calvinistic friends who I've contacted and tried to get us to reconcile over this and to talk to this, you won't have anything to do with it. You won't listen to them. What else am I to do, brother?
And Flowers is going to look at it and say, well, Calvin was just arguing with dissenters. Well, no, he was actually arguing with one of the most rank heretics that was on the scene during that day.
Okay, the dissenter, heretic, enemies, I use all those terms. Does it matter? Is there any justification for burning somebody at the stake like that? Or do we believe in religious liberty? Of course. You've already acknowledged that you disagreed 100%, you said, with Calvin's view of how you treat enemies. So why are you even making that point? Why do we even need to make that point if we've already agreed and we already conceded with the point that it's just amazing.
It's why Calvin was actually friends with Socinius, right? Who was also a heretic. He was friends with him. He wrote very cordial letters because he saw in Socinius a true heart that it was wrong, but it was seeking truth. Whereas Servetus was, by all accounts, a rather intolerable man to be around, very prideful.
So it's okay to kill him then? No, of course not. It's not. You wouldn't say that. I'm not even trying to say you're arguing that. But it's like you have put yourself into a corner to where you have to defend how bad that view is and acknowledging that view is bad, but now you're kind of putting yourself over in this corner now that you have to defend. And that's not even the point. It's not even the point. We've already acknowledged that Calvin and other people in that day held to a very bad belief that it was okay to torture and to kill people who were enemies of the gospel. And it does not have to be that way. And the argument, therefore, is that true good soteriology that we believe in, that God loves his enemies and is patient with his enemies and long-suffering towards his enemies, that would lead to a better reforming of that false view of the Roman Catholic use of force and capital punishment and torture to get people to align with you theologically.
sniveling isn't the right word, but in some cases, like his first book publications, he recanted to save his life in a heartbeat. So he had no conviction of beliefs, or he'd say whatever he would say for his benefit. And yet you have Calvin, who is one of the major reformers, who is one of the, all of us Protestants trace ourselves, back to the Reformation, and he's one of these people. And there's no charity there, because there's too much axe grinding for the anti-Calvinists to do to be bothered with this type of actual objective research. And they miss the simple fact that Servetus was not only the first heretic to be executed during Calvin's day, he was the last heretic to be executed during Calvin's day in Geneva. Right?
Way to go,
like
Calvin. Way to go. Way to stop those people. What does it matter? This is one of the shortfalls of naming a system after a person. You've got Tyler here having to defend, using all this time writing all these long articles, having to defend this man's character. Who the heck cares? It doesn't matter. Call it Reformed, call it Doctrines of Grace or something else, call it something different. Just like the first paragraph of my article said, this is a name that is stuck for whatever reason historically. Calvinism. I know you don't believe in baptism of infants, Tyler. I don't think you do. Maybe you do. I don't think that you do. At least I know as Baptists, we don't believe in baptism of infants. And Calvin did that just because we called David Platt, who is a Baptist Calvinist. Do we believe that Al Mohler believed in baptism because his name Calvinist? Calvinism is just a shorthand name for it. You don't have to spend all this time defending Calvin. He made some errors. He made some mistakes. We acknowledge those mistakes. We agree that we concede. You've already conceded the point that I made, that we made mistakes. Okay, so Philip Melanchthon believed more like I do, but he had similar errors. So what's the point? The point is, let's move on to talk about how, as Piper acknowledged, how certain types of individuals and certain belief systems can better defend and better hold on to bad social issues like abuse of religious liberty, like slavery, when you don't believe that God truly loves and has created all people equal and loves all people and truly values all people. That's the point of the discussion. That's the point of the article. And you won't engage it. You want to bury your head into historical facts about a person who has little to do with the issue that we're dealing with. And in the process, maligning me and everything that I've said and argued over the course of our discourse with each other, brother. I love you, man, but you've got to stop in the prideful discourse of maligning me and trying to paint me with the foil on my head and describing me in ways that are absolutely false. And I think you know better, brother.
To do. But even then, it was the only execution for heresy. So when you read Flowers' article and he says, there were 139 executions that happened during Calvin's time there. First of all, Calvin had no say in executions. But second of all, only one of those was for heresy. The rest of them were for things like adultery. One of the biggest things, actually, there was about 30 or so cases. I think it was 38 cases, and there were about 20-something executions that Calvin mentions, right? There could be more of them.
Why does it matter? He believed that it was okay to torture and to kill heretics. He said that he believed that. In his institutes, he said that he believed that. So, point's already made. And you want to see more of the facts of the matter, since he's spending all this time it's not from my article, by the way. It's Viola's article that I linked to. And from the link cited above, this is what he accused me of plagiarism, because he thought that I was taking credit for all these links. And I actually said, this is the link we cited. Okay, so he missed that point, I guess. Braxton Hunter called him out on it and everything else, but he still just stuck to his guns and said that I was plagiarizing. Between 1542 and 1546, there were 76 banishments. Total population of Geneva then was 20,000. Calvin's own stepdaughter and son-in-law were among those condemned for adultery and executed. In Geneva, there was little distinction between religion and morality. The existing records of the council for this period reveal a high percentage of illegitimate children, abandoned infants, forced marriages, and sentences of death. In one case, a child was beheaded for striking his parents. which is following of the Old Testament Mosaic law. Calvin believed it was scriptural to execute rebellious children and those who committed adultery. During the period of 17 years when Calvin was leading Geneva, there was 139 recorded executions in the city. Esteban Castillo, a friend of Calvin who urged him repeatedly of his intolerance, made the shocking remark, quote, if Christ himself came to Geneva, he would be crucified, for Geneva is not a place of Christian liberty. It is ruled by a new pope, John Calvin, but one who burns men alive while the pope at Rome strangles them first. Castillo also made this remark, can we imagine Christ ordering a man to be burned alive for advocating adult baptism? The Mosaic laws calling for the death of a heretic were superseded by the law of Christ, which superseded by the law of Christ, which is one of mercy, not of despotism and terror. Zwingli, Luther, and Calvin followed the tyrannical practices of the corrupt Catholic Church by promoting the use of state-sponsored torture and capital punishment against those who disagreed theologically, and heretics and adulterers and bad characters of all kinds. That's just a fact of the matter. Facts that Calvinists themselves have acknowledged and have repudiated. Why Tyler doesn't take that approach just to say, here's some things that Calvin held to: infant baptism, the abuse of heretics, the lack of religious liberty issues, some legalism issues that he held to. I don't like those things, but this soteriological view over here that he argues in these institutes and this, I agree with these. Why not just do that? Okay, why do you have to go through this 15-page, 5-part articles trying to defend this guy, all because it happened to be that your soteriological systematic gets his namesake? And so now you have to spend all this time trying to make this man look better than he really was. Why do you feel the need to do that, Tyler? I don't understand why you won't just acknowledge the issues and actually address those issues. Would you rather just spend the time talking about how this man really wasn't as bad as some people make him out to be? And Tyler may be right on some of those points. It's certainly the case that Pelagius was made out to be a lot worse man than he really was. And it's very likely that Calvin, by his opponents, was made out to be a lot worse than he really was too. I'm objective enough to acknowledge that very likely is the case. So how does that in any way affect the actual point of our contention and the point that I raised in the article, a point that you still, to this day, have not engaged with me on? Answer me that.
So you have all of these types of things. You also have other things that commonly happen well, and Flowers does this. You have a lot of people who will take quotes from Calvin and they'll read them completely out of context. Or they'll read them, and by out of context, I don't just mean out of context within Calvin's writing, because Calvin actually did mean if Servetus comes to Geneva, he's probably not going to walk out of here alive. It didn't mean that Calvin was going to have him beheaded. It did mean probably Calvin would have him reported, and we know what would happen, or we Calvin thought he knew what would happen to someone like that.
So he found himself having to defend Calvin in some ways and his beliefs. He's trying to soft pedal it, like make Calvin not quite so guilty. He concedes, yeah, Calvin was guilty, he did some bad things, but then he on the other hand, he's trying to make Calvin seem like he's not really all that guilty. And he actually misquotes, because it's not my article, it's Viola's article that I linked to, and so it's actually Viola's stuff here. And I'm going to show you Viola's article to show you how fair and balanced he actually is here, and see if you think Tyler is representing him or myself in any way correctly or accurately. He says Calvin believed that executing unrepentant heretics was justified, which he did. And like I said, Tyler already conceded that fact. The best known example of this is, of course, his consenting. Notice it doesn't say that Calvin did it. He said Calvin consented to the execution of Michael Servetus. Does that sound like a rabid anti-Calvinist that calls him a murderer? No. He says Calvin consented to the execution of Michael Servetus, a man who denied the Trinity and the baptism of infants. In other words, he actually tells what Servetus, the errors of Servetus. He actually doesn't try to hide that. He doesn't try to paint Servetus as perfect and good and all those kinds of things. Servetus was burned for 1 hour simply because of his theological views. He goes on to say Calvin's supporters are quick to point out that the great reformer didn't directly execute the man. He even tried to persuade Servetus not to come to Geneva. Calvin also tried to get Servetus to repent and sought for him to be granted a more humane execution, which was beheading instead of burning. Even so, Calvin made this remark regarding Servetus, showing that he believed death for heresy was justifiable. Quote, this is a quote from John Calvin. Okay, so we're not making a false accusation. We're using an actual quote, unlike Tyler's willing to do for me, apparently. At least we're actually quoting Calvin here, okay? Calvin says, quote, "But I am unwilling to pledge my word for his safety. For he shall come to Geneva. I shall never permit him to depart alive, provided my authority be of any avail." In other words, Tyler spends all this time talking about how Calvin doesn't have enough authority to get somebody killed. And yet he's saying, if I do have authority, if my authority will prevail, then he's not going to leave here alive. That's his will here. So during the Servetus trial, Calvin remarked, "I hope that the verdict will call for the death penalty." 9 years after the execution, Calvin made this comment in answering his critics. Quote, "Servetus suffered the penalty due his heresies, but was it by my will? Certainly his arrogance destroyed him, not less than his impiety." Calvin was also quoted as saying, quote, "Whoever shall now contend that it is unjust to put heretics and blasphemers to death will knowingly and willingly incur their very guilt. This is not laid down on human authority. It is God who speaks and prescribes a perpetual rule for his church." Did you hear what this is from his Institutes, guys. He's saying that you should be put to death if you think it's wrong to put heretics and blasphemers to death. That's his theological view, which Tyler, again, has already conceded. That's what's so crazy about this. Whether you agree with Calvin's view or not, again, this is Viola's argument, his article, defend his actions because he was a man of his times, which is another argument that Tyler says. Many Christians find the idea of executing heretics to be shocking. This brings up another point for another post, but consider for a moment if murder was legal in our time. If it were, I think we'd have a lot of dead Christians who lost their lives to other Christians over doctrinal trespasses. If you think I'm wrong, just watch the vitriol and the hatred that many Christians, excuse me, on online forums as they verbally bludgeon one another over theological interpretations. In addition to Servetus, Jerome Balzac was arrested in prison for challenging Calvin during a lecture, and then he was banished from the city. Calvin wrote privately about the matter, saying that he wished Balzac were rotting in a ditch. Jacques Groot was also a man who disagreed with Calvin. He called Calvin an ambitious, haughty hypocrite. The administrators of Geneva tortured Groot twice daily until he confessed. And with Calvin's concurrence, notice it's not saying Calvin did it himself. With Calvin's concurrence, Groot was tied to a stake, his feet were nailed to it, and his head was cut off for blasphemy and rebellion. Peter Emmerich was charged with slandering Calvin at a private gathering, and he was to pay a fine, but Calvin wasn't satisfied with the penalty, so Emmerich spent 2 months in prison. He lost his job and was paraded through town kneeling to confess his libel, also paying for the trial's expense. These are just, again, these are all documented. You can look at the citations to see if they're accurate or not. But something else that again accused of me and of Viola throughout this entire discourse with Tyler. Notice how he starts this article. This is, again, Viola's article that he's painting him as this rabid anti-Calvinist that's unreasonable and all those kinds of things. If you're new to the Shocking Belief series, I opened this post, Viola's saying, from the preface to the installment of the first series. This explains why precisely I'm producing this series. A well-known Christian authors whom I respect encouraged me to begin the series in the shocking beliefs of some of the greatest Christians who have impacted our church history. Every follower of Jesus is a rough draft. Over time, the great editor, the Holy Spirit, shapes our lives and views. But until we see the Lord and know Him as we are fully known, we are in process. This is also true of those Christians who have gone before us. Therefore, one of the mistakes we must guard against is to dismiss a person's entire contribution because they may hold or have held to ideas we find hard to stomach. Speaking personally, if I demanded that a person's views on every subject under the sun be identical to mine as a condition to be helped by them, then if I had met myself 20 years ago, I had disfellowshipped with myself. The truth is my views on some topics have changed over the years, and so have yours. Point: we are all in process. None of us gets everything right all the time. That stands true for every Christian who has ever breathed oxygen. So my purpose in highlighting some of the shocking beliefs of those upon whom shoulders we stand is not to burn these folks in efficacy, or is it to dismiss their position or contribution to the church history. Rather, it's to demonstrate that even though they may have held to views that would raise the eyebrows of most evangelicals today, that doesn't overturn nor neglect the valuable ideas they contribute to the body of Christ. Unfortunately, many evangelicals are quick to discount and even damn their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ over alleged doctrinal trespasses, even if those same brothers and sisters hold to historically orthodox creeds, the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed. Such discounting and damning can always be avoided, and it serves no one on the kingdom side of the aisle. When diversity within orthodoxy is encountered, grace should be extended, just as we would want grace extended to us, seeing that none of us sees perfectly. The word of Paul of Tarsus contains thunder and lightning for us all. Now our knowledge is partial and incomplete. 1 Corinthians 13:9. Notice that these beliefs will be shocking to some evangelicals, but not all. Some evangelicals claim that we aren't shocked or surprised by anything, so there's no need to write that in the comment section. And then he goes on to say the blog manager will delete any harsh statements like that. In other words, does this sound like a rabid anti-Calvinist that's just mean and foil on his head and calling Calvin as just this heretical murderer that we should just burn in efficacy, this Jihad John? Is that Viola? Because that's the way Tyler painted him throughout this entire discourse along with me. And yet that's exactly the opposite thing. And if you go to the end of the article, he actually quotes, matter of fact, let me pull it up, called Don't Miss the Point. He actually puts this throughout the article. He puts this, don't miss the point, over and over and over again. So what's the point? Don't miss the point of the article, according to Viola, says, now before any of you become apoplectic with ill feelings toward Calvin, here's a comment to keep in mind about this post and all the others in this series by one historian. I asked him to review the post for accuracy before I published it. I fully agree with his point about context. So you'll want to put out all of the above. You want to put all the above into perspective. Quote, this is the PhD, the Calvinistic PhD that he's quoting from here. He says, this is a compelling and well-researched post. In other words, this PhD, Calvinistic PhD historian, this is a compelling and well-researched post. I do wonder if it merits further context. It is roughly in the era of the Spanish Inquisition, for example, and Servetus purposely forced Calvin's hand by coming to Geneva. Calvin entreated him to give up his errors and sent him a copy of the Institutes, a great personal expense. Books were rare in these comedies back then, and dialogued with him. He showed pastoral care in this respect. Geneva was a place ruled by law, even theological law, but so were many of the other European cities. This was not a nice era. It was a rough life. As Hobbes said, the nasty, brutish, and short. Calvin's Geneva provided all kinds of pastoral care to the city and thrived under Calvin. It was also a place of refuge for Protestants from all over Europe. Geneva was not the exception in having tough communal structures. It was the rule. He quotes from Scott's Menashen's Calvin's Company of Pastors. A ton of good background could be of help here from Owen Stockin, assistant professor of Christian theology and history at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary and Boyce College. Okay, so Calvinistic college, by the way. Again, as in all the posts in this series, he goes on to say, this is Viola, the guy that Tyler is trying to paint as this rabid anti-Calvinist, the Jihad John kind of a guy, along with me. This is him. This is his article. He's posted all of this in the original article that I posted to, which is the only citation I gave to prove the point of concession that's already been made. Again, as it's the post in this series, the point is not to put great influencers of the Christian faith in a bad light or disregard their legacy. Rather, it's the opposite. So in other words, it's the exact opposite point that Tyler is accusing him of doing, and me subsequently, because I quoted from him. It's to show that even the most influential Christians who have changed the lives of countless people for good, Calvin being one of them, believed things that were surprisingly shocking and even outrageous. So tread carefully the next time you come across another follower of Jesus who doesn't believe just like you do on every doctrinal point. And when you're tempted to burn them over slow spit because of their bad theology, remember John Calvin, the man whom Charles Spurgeon said it was near flawless theology, and consider some of the other stuff the great reformer believed. Warning, if anyone wields accusation like John Calvin is the mouthpiece of Satan and other sentiments, our beloved blog manager says he won't approve the comment. In other words, he's opposing those anti-rabbit, anti-Calvinists that say things like John Calvin is the mouthpiece of Satan. Okay? He's opposing that just like I have, Tyler. And yet you continue after being shown this, after being sent this, after being appealed to over and over and over again. Tyler continues to ignore all of the appeals to reconciliation, all of these corrections again and again, and he continues to do it even to this day, where he's producing more broadcasts, lying that he's not accidentally misrepresenting me. I can't say that anymore because he's acknowledged he's listened to these things. He's shown that he's read these posts. He is blatantly in rebellion, and he is lying. I'm not trying to. That's just the truth of the matter. And I say it in love. I say it with concern for his soul, and that I don't know how he's allowed his heart to continue not to say, okay, I've messed up here. I know Leighton disagrees with the soteriology of Calvinism, but he's not one of those rabid anti-Calvinists that says these kind of horrible things, and neither is Frank Viola. It's clear that they're in a different category than I've tried to paint them. I thought of them in that category, and I kind of started attacking Leighton in that category, and now I realize that he's not, and I should have backed off back when it first happened, but I kind of set my teeth, and I let pride get in, and I've really gone after him now, and I've maligned him publicly, and I shouldn't have done that. That's the response Tyler needs to make now. Whether he will or he won't, I do not know. But I'm calling for him to recant his lies about me and my beliefs, and Viola and about his beliefs, because obviously he is not representing us properly, and that's unfortunate.
And the only other thing I would say about it, I know you're wrapping up. The only other thing I would say about it is that theologically and logically, even if the anti-Calvinist was right, even if Calvin was the person they said he was, and even if he was the unopposed dictator of Geneva and had Servetus killed, that does not undermine the truth of the theological system that we think Calvin synthesized from the scriptures. Right, because we don't trace our theology to Calvin. We just think Calvin was one of the best orators of the position.
Okay, does that sound familiar, guys? That's exactly what I started my article by saying. When I said I proudly wore the name of Calvinist, I honestly knew very little about it. The label is simply a shorthand explanation of sociological views. And non-Calvinists would bring up Michael Servetus, a man killed under Calvin's rule. Disagreement over doctrinal matters, I would simply dismiss them. I suspect is where many modern-day Calvinists are in this issue. They could take or leave the name Calvinist. They might have preferred to leave it in favor of labels like Reformed. Notice it said Calvinists see the personal arguments about John Calvin's harsh treatment of dissenters, heretics, enemies as distraction from the biblical doctrines that matter to them. Honestly, Calvinists have a valid point, I said. If the non-Calvinist is not willing to fully examine the biblical doctrines of soteriology as proposed by the Calvinists, they really have no ground to question the namesake of the systematic. Proof that John Calvin, notice here, this is the argument, I'm making the exact same point that Tyler's making right here. Proof that John Calvin treated dissenters, enemies, in a sinful manner does not prove that Calvinism's soteriology is wrong. Okay, that's the point I made. Keep that in mind as you listen to what Tyler is saying here. Listen.
So this is why ad hominems are always false. Even when Flowers thinks it's a valid, which is weird that he thinks it this is a valid use of a logical fallacy. It's still logically fallacious to say that because this person is a bad person, therefore the theology is bad.
Did you hear that? Because this person was a bad person, therefore his soteriology is bad. I just now said that's not the case. That because we find something wrong with John Calvin or what he has done does not prove that Calvinism itself is wrong. It doesn't. Okay? Doesn't. That's not, and that's the exact concession I just made. And then I went on to argue how, as he concedes, how certain people like Balthasar of Meyer and others who believed that God does love and provide for all people. And later on, in a more modern history of the 1800s, those who believe in the equality of all people are less likely defending social injustices like the abuse of religious liberty or slavery and those kinds of issues, because they hold to a sociological worldview and a worldview of mankind as being equal and loved and provided for by God. And therefore, it makes more sense that you have the Wesley defending the abolition of slavery, and you've got people like Whitefield using their theological beliefs of God's decree and theological beliefs of God's election of certain individuals. I mean, think about it. I mean, just the natural course of things. When you see a lot of white people coming to Christianity, and a lot of people over in foreign lands who are not coming to Christianity, and you believe that God has elected to save the people that he wants to save, isn't the natural conclusion to say, well, God must like white people? I mean, a lot of white people are coming to salvation, Christianity. Again, that's not what Calvinists today hold to, but you could see how people back in that day used that way of thinking, that God elects those who are saved. All things that happen according to God's decree and plan. Therefore, slavery happened according to God's decree and plan, that certain people were treated better than other people. Go back and listen to Basil Manley Jr., Basil Manley, and the founder of Southern Seminary. Listen to his argumentation for chattel slavery. Listen to how he defended it. He used a lot of the arguments that are based out of that Calvinistic worldview. It's just a fact of the matter. Again, I would love to have that discourse with Tyler in a rational, kind way. It doesn't have to be emotionally charged. It doesn't have to be something that we slander each other on or malign each other's views on. I think a rational discussion on how theology affects social issues, like the issue of slavery, like the issue of religious liberties. Let's talk about that, because that's what the article was about. He still has not addressed the actual point of contention, and I doubt that he ever will. I hope that he'll change his heart on this. I hope that he'll start to represent Viola and myself more accurately. But I suspect that he has a different line of way he wants to paint things, and he would rather not deal with the elephant in the room of how his worldview and the ideas that Calvinists hold to with regard to God creating certain people for glory and for salvation and other people for reprobation, how that could affect people historically throughout history and how they treat other people. I suspect that's an elephant in the room for a Calvinist that they just don't want to address because it's too difficult for them, and that's unfortunate. So anyway, hopefully this has been helpful to clarify a long-standing disagreement for all of you theology geeks that like to follow through this stuff. So let this be a lesson to us to treat each other with respect and love, and to actually represent each other correctly. Quote from the actual people, play my actual words. I suspect that he would never play my actual words because they might actually hear me being reasonable. And he couldn't put the tinfoil on my head if he could actually hear me talking with reason and cordiality. And so he would rather paint me as this individual that I'm obviously not. So hopefully that will change, and hopefully Tyler will repent of misaligning and misquoting and doing all of this horrible thing that he actually denounces for people doing against Calvin. He's doing to me, and I pray that will stop from this point forward. I hope that it will. Until next time, bye-bye.